This is the Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bord-Deronay. This week, our guest is Michael Kimmelman. Michael is an author, the architecture critic of the New York Times, and the founder of Headway. He also has a new book titled The Intimate City, Walking New York. With Michael, we discuss the housing crisis, the value of architecture, how architecture is perceived by non-architects, the state of the profession of architecture, and of course we talk about New York City, and we get his thoughts on some of the more recent projects that are in the press. It was a lovely conversation. I think you guys are going to enjoy it, and we will probably have Michael on again in the future. Sponsors. Are you tired of juggling multiple pieces of software and struggling with spreadsheets that aren't made for the realities of design and architecture in 2023? Built by and for designers and architects, Programma's all-in-one suite of tools has everything modern studios need for every stage of a project. Mood boards, the world's best specification tools, procurement tracking, project management, and more. All smartly integrated and easily shareable and always up to date, reducing time-consuming double handling and costly errors. Share work in various formats from PDFs to client-friendly, up-to-date online dashboards. Join the ranks of leading studios using Programma today. Click the Programma link in our show notes to start for free. We are supported by Enscape. Enscape is a fast and easy-to-use real-time visualization and VR tool for the AEC industry. Enscape is not a standalone application. Instead, it's a plugin, which makes things much easier. It plugs into Revit, SketchUp, Rhino, ArchiCAD, and Vectorworks. With Enscape, you can create realistic renderings, 360-degree panoramas, and videos, and you can even immerse clients in VR to give them a deeper understanding of their building. Enscape is used by more than 500,000 monthly users worldwide from over 150 countries. So if you want a fast and user-friendly real-time visualization experience, then click on the Enscape 3D link in our show notes.
If you're still using AutoCAD and separate 3D modeling program, then let me just tell you, stop that. Get with the times, people, and advance to a BIM computer program. The program we recommend is ArchiCAD. ArchiCAD leads the industry by enabling architecture and interior design firms around the world to 3D design. It's supported by innovative technology that expands as far as the imagination can stretch. As ArchiCAD continues to evolve with technological advances, architects can push that technology to their advantage while working in an accurate model. You can start your fully functioning free trial today by clicking the link in our episode notes.
This is the Second Studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, Michael. Here we go.
So I'm from New York City. I grew up about, 3 miles from where I'm talking to now, down in Greenwich Village.
Wow.
And, back then the Village was a very different place than it is now. It was still a middle-class neighborhood, ethnically mixed.
That's hard to imagine.
Yeah, very hard.
That's hard to imagine.
Yeah, I know. And of course, it was a kind of haven for a lot of, as the Village had been historically for more than a century, a haven for lots of different people who considered themselves outcasts or who were creatives and so forth. So it was an interesting place to grow up. And it was a rough neighborhood in some ways, too. Rough around the edges. I don't mean it was particularly dangerous, though when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, New York was a very different place, too. I say all of that because, that experience, and especially I grew up in a very left-wing household. My father was a surgeon, but he was very involved in a lot of politics, my mother, too. So my household and the households of my relatives who also lived in the Village were places where, sort of social affairs, issues around race and racial justice and other issues, anti-war stuff, and all that was the daily kitchen table conversation. And, this was Jane Jacobs' neighborhood. I actually knew her a bit.
Really?
Yeah. And so, I think that my interest in architecture to leap ahead
Sure.
Was sort of instilled in me just as a matter of course, because I was, I was living in a neighborhood which became, it was funny because when I read the death and life, I thought, well, I don't know what's so special about this. She's just describing
Really?
home.
Yeah, yeah.
But there was very much a sense of the connection between the neighborhoods we build, the physical fabric of a city and its operations, and these other issues that had been, as I said, the bread and butter of my upraising, which had to do with social justice and but also very practical issues. What worked for people? What was the function of the street and the sidewalk, public transit, and how do neighborhoods actually thrive, and what kills them off? So that upbringing was very. I always look back on as being sort of fundamental. I guess everyone's childhood is in some ways, but for me that definitely was.
So, but you were born in New York and you grew up in Greenwich and you were there until what period of time? Through high school?
Yeah, I lived in the village, of course, through high school, and then I went away to college.
Yeah, sure.
I was at Yale, and I studied. I had a life as a musician. Yale had a music school, but when I got to Yale, I'm a pianist.
Oh.
And I'm still a pianist. I still give concerts and things.
Wow.
But at Yale, I became interested in other things, and started to study history and became a very serious student.
Mm-hmm.
And then thought I would go into academia, but came back to New York to contemplate what path to take. And I really fell by sheer chance into a job as an editor of ID magazine. In retrospect, that sounds very cool, but it was a measure of how bad ID was, how badly run, and that they hired me. I was absolutely, no experience, no nothing.
Right.
But it was great. So I suddenly was thrown into, a world of design and a wide range of design, industrial design, graphic design, of course, and of editing and writing professionally. So when I then did go on, I then went to Harvard and started to pursue a PhD, which I didn't quite finish for various reasons. I had one foot out the door already and was writing about design and architecture and some other things too. And I became the architecture critic of a short-lived but really amazing publication called New England Monthly that was started by a very remarkable editor named Daniel Okrent.
Uh-huh.
And so, I sort of had these two paths, one academic and one not, but both interested in art and architecture. But then when I was at Harvard, because I was making a little money on the side and still writing journalistically, I was offered a job and had signed a book contract, actually, for a book I had intended to write. So I was also still not quite working on my dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
And I took the job, which was working for a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll go into it if you want, but there was a period of a few years in which I sort of intended to go back, although I never really was convinced that I wanted to have a life entirely in the academic world. I think having been outside in the real world, I was, it ties back to my upbringing because my house was full of journals and newspapers, and there was a sense I got through my parents and just to my upbringing that there was a public conversation that was a important part of civil society and democratic society, and that to participate in that was a useful thing to do. So I liked the public nature of the conversation, and I liked the democratic nature of a newspaper and magazine writing. So I think what I was really doing was finding a home in which to write that I felt had a purpose outside the academy. And after a couple of years, the Times hired me. And at first I was writing about music and then about art, because I had been trained at Harvard to do that. But my first interest had been in architecture and design. And when I got the job, I was quickly made the chief art critic at the Times. And although I was academically trained to do that, I had really no experience in the contemporary art world in New York. So I was, it was a little like ID. I was hired for a job for which I was completely unqualified.
So I do want to ask a question about that. And there's many things to unpack with the story that's been told so far, but I find it very interesting when very successful people who are very good at what they do have their life story, and there are key moments when they are entrusted by somebody and hired by somebody to do something that they would seem on paper to be unqualified for. So the question is, do you have a sense of why those publications or companies had hired you? And then other than desperation, perhaps, in case of ID. But then also, what is it about you at that time that allowed you to do the job as well as you did?
I can't speak for why the Times did this exactly, but I think, look, I'd like to think that they saw in me the potential to become something which I was not yet. I had been writing for the Times. It's not like they arbitrarily chose somebody completely off the street.
Right.
I've been there a little bit, but they were taking a gamble. I suppose they appreciated the fact that I really, how can I don't quite know how to put this. It's hard. You're asking me a difficult question.
I know.
Why me? But I think part of it was also I care a lot about journalism, the standards of journalism, being a good reporter, doing stuff that is not just thumbs up, thumbs down on criticism. I think I saw and I see my role as speaking to as wide an audience as possible within the context of an institution like the New York Times, and not just answering to the bubble of, and in the case of the art world, it's really bubble society. But trying to translate and to make meaningful the issues that I was writing about, and that these fields address and raise. And I think they saw that because I had a kind of diversity of interests. So I wasn't like there are a lot of people I think who get into a field like criticism in the arts because they want a place in that universe. I don't mean this critically. It's a fact, I think. They write about film because they love films, but they're not a director or an actor or whatever. And that wasn't really my condition. I was coming at this more as a writer and as a journalist, even though I had training in this too. So I think that ability to translate for a wider audience is meaningful. It's also crucial, I think, to the health and welfare of the fields that you're writing about. And certainly that's true in architecture, about which I have strong feelings about its relevance to the world. I think, the art world, you can make a kind of case that it is a sort of bubble. It is maintained an inside and outside, which has a lot to do with the history of modernism, and that is now become an economic tool. But I think architecture, at its peril, adopts that kind of inside-outside approach, and the consequence of doing that is to make a public hostile to or simply uninterested in architecture, when in fact architecture is the story of, the world we are building.
Do you think that architecture has become, in the past years, whatever period of time that means, more exclusionary or more bubble-like than before?
No, actually, I think, look, I've been doing this job now 11 years, I think 12. I just realized my math has never been my strong suit. I think the field has changed quite a lot. And when I took over this job, I did so with the taking a gamble, but also betting on the fact that there had been a certain exhaustion of a conversation around sort of architecture and this idea of architecture really as an extension of, sculpture in the art world, and that there was an appetite and a new younger cohort of people going into the field who were interested in thinking of architecture differently and in broader terms. And so I do think that the last number of years have changed the conversation around architecture, and I think for the better.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that so I taught architecture off and on for about 6 years. I don't teach anymore, but because of that, have been exposed to even the younger generation, different from mine, which I feel like the generation differences are getting tighter and tighter in terms of years. But anyway, so the younger generation below me, they are 100% much more concerned with certain issues that even my generation, when I was in school, they were around, but they weren't talked about as heavily. So social justice, sustainability, ecological concerns, basically those things, those are at the forefront of every student's mind. Like 95% of them. It's kind of remarkable to hear it from them. And it seems to be that they come up with those ideas, or they come up with they declare this is important before we even have to tell them it's important as teachers. They just come to the table already with, how do I solve this problem with architecture? And it's both refreshing and also, I guess I said, surprising. I'm like, wow, okay, you're a first-year student. Let's have this conversation, I guess.
Yeah. I teach at Columbia at GSAP, and I agree. I think there's just a different mindset going into it. And as I said, I think it's more collaborative. I think at a lot of elite schools, you still have, at least among the architecture students, the idea that everyone's going to become Zaha or, I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Something. But I think within that, there are now different models. And you could see, mass group, for instance, this idea of sort of social work, and being more collaborative. I think that's very appealing at the moment. There's a pendulum swing. I meant it when I said that when I started to do this, I felt that the timing was right. I think, the first thing I wrote about was an affordable housing project in the South Bronx, which was a very much on purpose. It was a very interesting project. It raised a lot of issues about the relationship of architecture. What is the value of architecture in the context of a project where the cost per unit has to be weighed against really pressing social needs. I think that had I done the same thing 5 or 10 years earlier, it would have fallen on deaf ears.
Right.
So, the pendulum swings. It will at some point, swing again. I don't necessarily see that as a problem. I think architecture has historically been a conversation we have had with ourselves about the meaning of what we build, the language of architecture, and that is not a static thing. But at the moment, I think it is a good thing that architects are trying to make themselves more relevant to a wider public, and to understand that their role, their profound role in shaping the society we build, is not just about designing beautiful objects for people to occupy, but also helping us reimagine the world at a time when, there are a lot of really serious crises around issues like housing and climate and so on.
Yeah. That's interesting.
People,
yeah, go ahead, please.
No. I mean, I was to elaborate. I mean, I think architecture had talked itself into a corner, basically, in which people felt that it was an elite endeavor. It is an elite endeavor in its purest form, of course, but
because it's expensive.
Yeah, because it's expensive.
Yeah, I just wanted. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, in the case of Via Verde, for instance, that project that I first wrote about, there is a premium for the quality of architecture that Grimshaw added to the project. Grimshaw partnered with Datner, and that was a showcase project in which it raised explicitly a question: what is the value of architecture as a social good? But I think to get back to the way I was framing it, the fact that architects had leaned into the notion that the practice was really for just wealthy people and museums and museum patrons and so forth, made people feel that architecture had nothing to do with them. And therefore, architects who have already basically given up so much of their leverage by working for fees and being essentially servants to clients and developers, not having their own skin in the game very often. There's a lot of ways in which architecture has narrowed its purview. And I think one of the challenges for architecture is to reclaim its significance as a social force. And, because you guys, you're also trained to do things which we need now, which is to bring people together around a table to decide very complex issues. Issues around community, neighborhoods, issues that are not only about specific things we build, but matters of social practice. That's, I think, something that is not widely shared among other fields, but it's inherent in the way you need to do your work. So I think you guys are extremely important, and as models and as leaders, and I also think your ability the necessity of compromise, which is generally what is necessary in projects where you are not just working for some wealthy patron who will just say, go do it, which is, of course, can sound very appealing, but is very rare. And that was the sort of architecture that was celebrated for a while. Yeah. I think the fact that 99.99999% of the architecture that is built does involve some forms of compromise and negotiation is also really important at a time when we are a divided society and it is difficult for us to get anything done. Even, I'm looking out my windows while I turn to the side, even, building a bulb out on a curb. Right. Or taking a parking space, much less, building a skyscraper.
Yeah. Well, maybe more architects need to go into higher up positions and not just be practicing architecture to get things done. It's long been a position in theory of mine that would actually be a good thing. But you said a lot of really, really interesting things. And one of them being the kind of shift of the focus of architecture, generally as a profession from one thing to another, from certain issues to another. And I think I never really thought about it this way, but I think it's very interesting because, when you study to become an architect, and this depends on the school you go to, but when you're a young architect, let's say, you understand the breadth of the things that an architect should look at and the importance of an architect, a lot of things you mentioned. And I guess it is really about existing at a certain moment in time, because I think for most, they have that wide thinking, but in terms of what they're able to do in practice, there's a lot of practical problems with practice also, but in practice or just the profession as a whole is very different from that. And there's the general shifts of the pendulum swinging back and forth, like you mentioned. But also, I think it's just it's confusing for the outsiders, for the general public, to understand what an architect does, what one architect does, when all architects practice, potentially very differently, and architecture is so broad. Like we were talking before, I have a master's in urban design. That's always been a huge interest of mine. There are a lot of architects who could care less about urban design, which I have my issues with, but that's like, so you have that. And I think it's therefore on the public side, it's difficult to kind of understand what exactly you do, because we find clients and people who think architects are for only the elite and we do fancy art things. And we find ones who are like, well, you must be the ones in charge of designing neighborhoods, it's sort of.
Right.
And or designing the engineering.
Or engineering a building, which is one we get a lot too. So anyway, that's just me thinking out loud, but I think you're right.
No, I think you're also raising another issue, right? Which is that, as I said, what you do is fundamentally collaborative, right? So it involves engineers, it involves a lot of other, parties usually, especially if they're large public projects. Obviously, it's different if you're redoing someone's kitchen, but whatever. There's very often a kind of team, and architecture is, a friend of mine, Guy Nordenson, who's an engineer and obviously has worked on a lot of conspicuous projects, teaches at Princeton. He's got a bee in his bonnet about this fact that when we talk about projects, we should acknowledge the engineers who are involved and the whole team of people who contribute, because it's like a film. The director doesn't just do this by himself. It's not just an actor. It's a lot of players but the stories we tell about architecture have generally been like the stories we tell about so many other things, sort of focused on a single figure, a hero.
Yeah, there's a hero.
Or a heroine.
Yeah.
And that idea that the architect becomes that, partly because the skin of the project is what you see. It's harder, as Guy will point out, to focus on the work of an engineer that might be incredibly inventive and beautiful, but is essentially masked in many cases. But whatever, we tend to do that process of heroizing to the extent that people even know what an architect is. They presume, of course, that that there is this whole thing that you've done by yourself. But I just wanted to get back to something you said, which is this disconnect between the idea that you're an architect, but you're somehow, not related to, not interested in urban design or urban planning or, or landscape, whatever, is just, I think, also a problem.
Yes. Yeah.
A big one.
Yeah, a really big one, and it's mysterious again to people outside the field. They don't know a difference between an urban planner and an urban designer, and they don't. Why should they?
Sure.
But I think that sort of siloing of responsibilities and ideas is what has also created a problem for architecture, because it's as if the architectural aspect of the work exists in a vacuum and not, on a street, in a community, in a context. And that's how people experience it. Right. So this disconnect between reality, effectively, and the profession is, I think, detrimental to the profession.
Yeah, I agree entirely. That's why I've always thought about certain architects' work and this work coming out of certain schools as being more like architectural research rather than architecture. Which is to say, it's not invalid, it's not important, but at some point, if all of your focus is going just to the mechanics of this new facade, that's great for us to learn from, But if I got to be the judge of the building, I don't know if I would say it's architecture or that it's striving to be architecture. I think it's just trying to do architectural research. And I think the problem is that a lot of architects, and I guess also the general public, is a confusion between the two. And, you know, I think as a person who's always been interested in these broader issues, it's just personally frustrating. It's like, that's I like it. It's cool. It has some value. Yes, it contributes, but I don't know. There seems to be a lot of other conversation to be had about, as you put, reality, which is, I think, a really interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and also I think kind of like the ground level of the buildings, you know, in general, how they interact with the interstitial spaces, the building that's next to it. Even if it's just a mid-block building sandwiched between two others, there's still a front, an entrance, and an access. And it's not because you have like, you know, cool mechanical facade details that it's actually doing anything on the day-to-day person who's walking by or living near.
Right. So it's a lot about who you're doing this for.
Yeah.
And, you know, who you consider the audience for this. I mean, I should hasten to add that, you know, a lot of the most interesting material, physical material, formal invention, it helps push the language of architecture forward.
Oh yeah.
You know, I'll just say, you know, the funny thing about me was because I had sort of fallen into a job as the art critic, which I had not really chosen to do, but I wasn't going to turn down the gig when I was so young. The perception, and then I went off to Europe and I wrote a column for the Times and around politics and social affairs and cultural stuff around Europe and the Middle East. But I still was identified, I think, as the art critic for many people when I was named the architecture critic. And I think there was a lot of concern that I was going to come in and just, you know, be an exaggerated version of what we already, you know, had in the architectural world, which was a conversation around architecture as if it was entirely about formal and material invention, as if it was sculpture. And then I turned out to be like the opposite. So I always feel I must hasten to add that I of course, I'm deeply interested in and engaged by, you know, buildings that are, as you say, really concerned with their own formal invention.
Yeah.
But I think I make choices because of, you know, just a limited bandwidth about what is useful to write about.
Huh.
And I very consciously have wanted to say, in speaking to architects and especially to young architects, if you do projects which may not be the most extraordinarily, you know, visually spectacular, but have other, you know, other qualities, whether that is, for instance, working within extremely limited budgets on, let's say, deeply affordable housing and doing something that's, you know, as good as one can do under those circumstances, that the thing that I can do is turn a spotlight to projects like that, because that is another sort of work. And that deserves both dignity and to get the kind of, you know, attention that is going to draw some of the most gifted designers to do that work and get that attention themselves. I think that's part of my role. Yeah. And one reason I've written more about that than about, say, Rex's Perlman Center in New York, which is obviously a kind of amazing work of architecture. But, you know, it isn't social housing.
Yeah. No, that's a really, really good point. And one of the things I've always wondered is, for a person in your position, how do you choose which things to focus on? I suppose at some moments in time, it kind of tells itself. It's obvious, like, we should be writing about this.
Do you have like a running list of things you want to write about?
I mean, I wish I could tell. There's no. Obviously, I've been asked this question before.
Yeah.
When will you write about us? That's what people want to know.
Oh, no, don't write about us.
No, I don't mean us. I mean like whoever it was in the past.
I understood what you meant. And yes, implicit in that is often, why would you write about us, or when will you?
Yeah.
There really isn't I don't really have a great answer, because it's not a systematic thing. It often has to do with, yes, there are some things that present themselves to me that I feel I really need to do. This year, for instance, there were two projects in New York. They're both really kind of out there architectural projects. One was Jeannie Gang's Gilder Center at the Museum of Natural History. I had written before about that as a project in the works and as an issue of NIMBYism in the neighborhood and stuff like this. So I wanted to follow up on it, but it was also sort of a gamble architecturally that was interesting. Perlman was another example. It was kind of an obvious thing to do, but I have skipped a lot of projects like that. And, I don't feel good about skipping them. I'm not trying to avoid that. It's just a question of time. And as I said, of using the spotlight that I have to create certain kinds of emphases, which are not meant to diss other things exactly, but are meant to honor some things which have been underrepresented. I'll just tell you right off, I don't know if I've ever said this before, but when I took over my job, Michael Arad's memorial at Ground Zero opened like the day after I got back from Berlin.
Wow.
And the question arose whether I would just review that, because that was the obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
And I quite consciously said no, because I did want to establish a different kind of logic to what I would be doing. And it was not to, I have great respect for Michael Arad, and I don't want to go after him or this here. I have my issues with that particular project, but that was not really why I didn't want to write about it first. It was mostly that I just thought we need to just turn this ship around a little bit.
Yeah.
And so let's just start another conversation before. And I was a blank slate, so I knew that I was sort of going to have to establish myself with a skeptical audience. And there are times when I have since then had to make certain kinds of choices like this. But I can't tell you that there's like I've got this all figured out. It's an evolving thing. And sometimes something will just arise, and it seems like the right thing to do. And I look for things that are in some way emblematic of something larger than themselves. That's always the case, because my practice is triage. Almost everything that happens, I don't write about.
Right. That is interesting. It is interesting. It made me think a lot of things, but just a funny question is, I've also always wondered if you're a critic like yourself or a writer like yourself, is it hard to have friends as architects? Or architects as friends, rather?
I mean, it's a good question. I kept my distance a lot in the art world, and I maintained professional friendships in the architecture world, where I think that there's a kind of it's an easier community, I think, for me, I find personally, to establish cordial relations. I could not do my job at all if I didn't have the ability to talk to people, have people I could consult with and feel comfortable chatting with. I think it's always important to talk to the architects whose projects I'm writing about, and I don't, there's no conflict there. I'm going to write what I'm going to write. I'm often making a choice about what I'm going to do, and I've made a decision about those projects on some level before I've ever approached anybody about them. if you know what I mean. I've made a decision why that's an interesting project.
Yeah.
So I'm rarely going into that conversation with the expectation that I'm about to betray this person. But I don't write about close friends. And that's not, because I didn't come up through this world. It's not like I had a bunch of friends who I was already connected to and was going to sort of have to either promote or abandon.
Right.
My relationships with architects have developed through the work.
And now a little break for our show sponsors. Dear architects and designers, do you know the current spend on your budget? Can you forecast your next 6 months of performance? Do you know the status of all your projects? Have your team's hours been effectively allocated? If you struggle to answer these questions quickly and easily, then you need to explore Monograph. Monograph is a performance management platform. It helps you and your firm make better day-to-day decisions and anticipate what's next with powerful forecasts. It's designed by architects for architects. With Monograph, you get less obscurity and more visibility, less ambiguity and more clarity, less admin and more design. You have to see it to believe it. Your performance becomes a lot easier to manage because it's no longer hiding from you. Tap the Monograph link in our show notes to see for yourself.
The Second Studio podcast is made possible by support from Autodesk.
Autodesk has been part of the design conversation since 1982, providing the tools that help architects around the globe imagine and create beautifully designed, memorable buildings that people love and admire. Autodesk supports the work of the Second Studio, bringing the architecture community together, sparking curiosity, and leading vibrant interviews with the industry's visionaries and thought leaders.
The Second Studio works hard to carry the architecture conversation forward, and Autodesk is proud to contribute to this podcast. If you want to learn more about Autodesk, click the link in the episode notes.
The one thing I was wondering is, it's been 11 years since you've been the critic for architecture? 13,
well, I
12.
was doing the math.
12.
So
12,
I was
that's
the end
right.
of 2011, so it's 12, I think, yeah.
So during the last 12 years or even beyond that, what has been something that you've learned about architecture and architects that has kind of surprised you?
In a good way or in a bad way, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, let me think about that a little bit. What I will say that I think architects undervalue themselves. I know there's a sort of mythology out there about architects being sort of, chest thumping egomaniacs, some of whatever. This has served some of the mythology of architecture. Huh. My own experiences that architects I deal with are thoughtful, cordial, generous, deeply interested in what they are doing, and competitive, but also open, and that in some ways architects have undervalued themselves and their potential for playing a meaningful role at large in society. Getting back to what I was saying before. I would say that maybe that perception of mine is shaped by the fact that artists are kind of exactly the opposite.
Huh. Yeah.
I have friends who are artists, and many of them I love. But there is, I think, what artists are doing essentially is putting everything about themselves on the line in a thing which doesn't need to exist.
Yeah, sure.
And sort of, so there's no separation between their ego and the work. And that has its benefits, I guess, but it also it makes for a world in which opinion, which is an odd thing for me to say as a critic, I realize, but opinion carries too much weight. Because essentially,
in art or in art?
Yeah, in art.
Yeah.
Whereas in architecture, there is a lot of opinion, but there's also just a lot of facts, right? Like, whatever you think of, I don't mean to, linger too long over Villa Verde, now a 12-year-old project, but whatever you think of the architecture of Villa Verde, it does certain things. It has a certain number of units for people at a certain level of AMI, and for first-time homeowners, and it produces a certain amount. Its community garden produces a certain amount of, there's stuff which is quantifiable that it is doing, and its sustainability levels are measurable, and so forth. So we can have a conversation that's sort of separate from just with these questions of taste or personality. I don't know how I drifted over to this part of an answer, but it has made it for me much more interesting, actually, to have conversations with architects. And I think it's partly explains what I mean by their generosity and curiosity and collaborative nature.
It's making me wonder. I've always felt that the great the value that architecture has, and also the struggle it has as a profession, as a practice, comes from the fact that it's kind of split between these two sides of, call it the scientific or the more quantifiable things that it does offer, as you've put it, versus the artistic. And you can break that down to other things too. So I think architecture has always existed at this intersection of a bunch of different lines of thought.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so important. But it also makes it really difficult, I think, to oftentimes describe succinctly. I think it also makes it difficult. I'm thinking out loud, I'm also wondering if it makes it difficult for architects in general to be as strongly presented as maybe artists are, or as, frankly, interior designers. That's maybe a different conversation. But the parallels that you're describing between architects and artists, I see very strongly between architects and interior designers. There's a kind of boldness and a clarity that interior designers speak from, and architects a lot of times lack that. And I don't know. I don't know if it's because architects are inherently trying to juggle like 5 different things, and it maybe makes the story that they tell more difficult and murky, which is maybe also why having someone like you is important.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I believe in the thing I'm about to say because it just popped into my head. But I'll say one of the, and this is not a diss about interior designers, although it's going to sound like it, but in a sense, like artists, the stakes are much lower.
Yeah,
of course.
And, I mean, so there, again, a lot of it does have to do with show, and, it can be sort of undone, and there's not, I think there's some of that element to it, that the stakes are just higher for architects. And so there's a caution built in, and, there are many other players usually who are interested in the results than there are when you're just dealing with interior designers or artists. But it's also maybe part of the training. I don't know. You do need to. You do need to know what the limits of your own responsibilities are. You do need to ultimately. I hope the way I'm sounding expresses my deep respect and admiration for the practice of architecture and for architects, because I think, you're constantly. Having to deal with compromise. You're constantly going through a process which ends up getting nowhere. I was just talking to an architect who put, in this case, his heart and soul into a competition, got pretty far, cost a fortune, the usual story. Probably should have won.
Right.
Yeah.
Didn't. And that's the end. That's it. I mean, that sort of thing that's a lot to deal with as a kind of fundamental aspect of your occupation, and it means that you have to sort of construct a persona, which is on some level, how you sell yourselves, but you also have to make yourself, likable and someone who people want to spend a fortune to work with,
right?
In a sense, artists, I don't know why I'm constantly going back to the artist analogy, but artists, in a sense, can cultivate the exact opposite, and they can, in some cases, make their own money to do their own things. So it just requires a different set of skills, and I think those skills are sort of amazing. and in some ways make architects, to me, that much greater artists because they work with these limits. And I think all great art requires working within limits. I think most great artists would say that. And for architects, those limits are profound and always there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm going to loop that back and listen to that on the dark days of the practice.
Yeah.
A few minutes ago in the conversation, you were talking about the value of architecture, and it's an interesting thing because on here, obviously, we talk about architecture a lot, and we talk to a lot of architects, and so the value of architecture, which kind of bleeds through the podcast, kind of just over time. But I want to ask you, in your mind, what is the value of architecture? I recognize that's also a pretty big question, and it's also a question I would say that sometimes, like if we ask different architects, we would probably get different answers. And so it's an interesting thing.
I mean, I think architecture is the chronicle of our civilization. It is who we are. It's the most public record of our values and what we wish to leave behind. Although buildings are not permanent,
Sure.
they're, I think the most public record that we have of civilization is through the remains of architecture. And in any case of our relatively recent history, which means the last few hundred years, it's what we live with. It's what we decide is the world we wish to live in. And it has evolved. Its language has evolved. Its engineering technology has evolved in ways that are also expressions of our shifting values and our shifting knowledge as a civilization. So, I mean, I think architecture is a record of us, and but it's also more than that. Okay, I'll go back. Via Verde. So, what is the premium? What is that value that is added? Since your audience is, I'm sure a lot of architects, my argument was there is value to that, that is worth the premium, even though you could build a much less distinguished building with more units at a time when we desperately need more units of affordable housing. That would be, that would serve the purpose. But I think the answer is in the architecture, which is that it has given, in a neighborhood where for many generations now, there has been no sense that the rest of the city should care or has any investment in this part of the Bronx, that this is a place that deserves the same level of dignity, the same complexity of artistic expression as any other neighborhood. It's a monument and a testimony to the value of the people there. And the fact that Villa Verde has, over these 12 years, done very well, it's been very well maintained. It's very well regarded, that the residents have treated it well and other people have come to think of it well. It is as a consequence of that architecture. So, I mean, I think that's one of the most profound. You saw that in Medellin, for instance, as well. There's a desire, to sort of give you another example far afield, the desire to put works of really distinguished architecture in informal, poor slum neighborhoods in Medellin that had actually no real architecture at all. Was a way of saying, we value you as well, and you deserve no less as public money. We will go to your neighborhood to see something important, just as we ask you to come to ours. So there's something, I think, deep and profound about that. But as a practical matter, economically too,
Yeah.
people are going to preserve things that seem to be, valuable to them.
I like that answer. That's a great answer. All of it was very interesting. I think also viewing architecture as kind of this record is something that is probably would not have been my first thought, but it's a very, very interesting one. It's totally true. And I think actually, I mean, at the broadest sense, anything that we create is some kind of statement as to who we are as an individual, as a company, as a client, as a neighborhood, as a city, as a civilization that exists at this particular moment in time. And I think, again, that's another example of probably a larger perspective that I would hope most architects have as a result of their training. And it's just obviously, again, that gap. It's not, that doesn't mean that everyone else perceives the significance of architecture
Right.
to that degree. But of course, for us, even if you are doing a house, like that is what you're doing. This house I'm doing and I'm creating or designing, even though it's only 1,500 square feet, it's this tiny thing. It's a mark on
Right.
physically on the earth, first of all. And if it's going to be here for the next 50 years, let's hope, better make it a good one.
Well, and it
And-
should be thought like that.
Yeah.
A lot of buildings, at least in California, especially single-family homes, are oftentimes thought as more of a consumer product, and things are going to
Yep.
be taken down, changed, and not anything that's going to ever last in time. And
Yeah.
it's
An investment thing, you put money into it, you get money out of it, and then
Yeah.
Right.
that's pretty much all you care about,
Yeah.
actually.
Right. And I mean, that's what I'm saying. It is a mirror of who we are and what we
Yeah.
value. That is, as you point out, for better and for worse. And a lot of the, McMansions and other crap that's built around the country is a reflection of, some of our worst values.
Yeah. Yeah.
And our worst priorities. But, hopefully the good architects are responding to that with, there's always going to be a minority of projects that represent our best selves. But I like to think that those are the ones that we tend to want to keep and that remind us of what we can do if our values are right and when we have the skills and understand that this is who we are and how we want to be remembered.
A few minutes ago, you were talking about housing. We could easily talk for another 6 hours, I know, but you were talking about housing,
Okay.
and obviously the lack of housing, affordable housing, is a problem kind of across the board in the United States. In New York City, one of the ideas that's always tossed around casually amongst architects and non-architects is, well, we had the pandemic, and this thought applies to New York, LA, SF, a lot of places. We had the pandemic. A lot of people are working remotely. Still that's the case. We have a ton of office buildings, office space. Why not leverage some of that space and turn it into affordable housing or something? And so I guess there's two questions. One, is that a viable route? But more broadly, with the few minutes we have left, what is the solution exactly to creating more affordable housing?
So the office building thing is, of course, I think the office building is like a lot of answers we come up with, a desperate attempt to find some simple solution to a complicated problem. Office buildings are not the solution to the affordable housing crisis. As I'm sure you guys actually know, there are buildings that can be converted, older buildings with floor plates that are not, like most of the larger, more recent office buildings. And those conversions are complex and expensive and do not probably yield affordable apartments. They might yield some apartments, and we can use more housing, period. So what one can say, I think, is that office buildings are part of a larger solution, a slice of the problem, but not the whole thing, obviously, not anything vaguely like it. I don't group New York, LA, and San Francisco in the same bucket because, New York is pretty dense. It could be denser. there's a golf course in the Bronx. I once did this calculation, which has been or had been managed, I think it may still be, by a former president who shall remain nameless.
Sure.
And, that's a bunch of acreage. I did the calculation at some point, and if it had the same density of housing as Manhattan, if it were converted into a place for new housing, that alone would yield, I don't know, I forgot the number now, but something like 60,000 units.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So there is even land in New York, but it's a complicated question. In Los Angeles, you enter into a much more complicated question because there is an abundance of land that could be built into housing. You have every single large avenue and street and boulevard there basically could be built up. So there's no shortage. You have all these huge boulevards with 3- and 4-story houses or retail strip malls and so forth. What you have is resistance to that kind of densification.
Yeah.
And I, having spent some time there, I understand, I do, the idea of trying to preserve one's sense of home and not wanting to turn everything in New York. But there's a big gap between...
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, this is the thing, is that most people, when they hear multifamily housing and they hear, 4 stories or whatever else comes across their ears, they immediately jump to imagining somewhere in Manhattan or something like that. And, there's plenty of ways to retain the experiential identity of a place like Los Angeles, while also giving a lot of housing to people. It's not a
right. Yeah, right. I mean, you don't need 80-story buildings, but 10 is not going to be a catastrophe in many places, especially along these long stretches of retail. And I just think there's room for housing. How you finance that housing, exactly where it goes, what the mix of affordability is, what affordability means, that's a long, complicated conversation. But look, I mean, we should be a country that provides a right to housing. That's different than a right to shelter, and it's a disgrace that we have failed, so many hundreds of thousands, really millions of people in this country. And have made housing so difficult. And that is because you also have a lot of people who consider themselves progressives who for their own reasons have decided, whether it has to do with historic preservation or neighborhood preservation or environmental reasons, if that's what they claim, who resist more development. And,
sure.
This is a political problem, and now we've come full circle. We can't really talk about architecture and the role it can play in dealing with society's needs without broadening the conversation out to these other issues, which are about where we are as a body politic.
The city that came to mind in that last portion of what you're saying is San Francisco, which I'm sure you know. It's a very strange place because it's very progressive. It has that history and it is that way, but it's also hyper conservative. I have 2 things I wanted to hear your thoughts on. One was the USCB dormitory that was, quote, designed by Charlie Munger, R.I.P., I guess. Yeah. And the second is a completely different thing, is the and I'm forgetting the name. I think it's the Sainsbury Wing in the
National Gallery in London.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, okay.
That was designed by VSBA or Ventura Scott Brown, and is now going to be undergoing a complete redesign or remodel by, I forget the New York architect.
Seldorf.
Annabelle Seldorf. Yeah.
Yeah, so
those are 2 extremely different.
I know. Those are just personal questions of mine that have nothing to do with each other.
It's a wildly random project. So, I mean, I don't know a lot about the dorm. I was tempted to write about it. It just sounded like it sounded insane, is the truth.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm glad it's died a death, a proper death, because that was never really going to work. I mean, by the way, that does raise the issue of converting large-scale office buildings.
Yeah.
Sure.
Because the floor plate's just so enormous. You have no place to bring in light and so forth.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say beyond that, except I'm glad that's not going forward. Although, as a writer, of course, that would have been a wonderful target.
Juicy subject.
Yeah, juicy, sick. Yeah, and exactly the wrong patronage and architect, and if they can call it an architect.
Yeah.
The Sainsbury wing, So this is a longer story. I have what is perhaps an unorthodox view of this within the architecture community, though I'm not sure how unorthodox it is, because in London, I think most people share my view. But I'm not sure in the architecture community in London. It's just hard to know. But, you had a project by Venturi Scott Brown, which was a very interesting and important example of postmodern architecture, that was an interesting addition at a crucial site that changed the circulation, but also the perception of that institution, but was a really bespoke building for the galleries. And then the rest of it, I think, never really was very successful. So this is a good example of a building respected in the architecture world, but as a practical matter, not really very useful. And here my background in art, I think, helps, because I was in and out of that building all the time. The part that Seldorf is redoing of it is the part that really has never worked. It was Denise Scott Brown has made arguments about why this was architecturally designed the way it is, and I believe her. But I also know that over the years, and talking to many curators and other people who've had to deal with the building, that it doesn't really work very well. The galleries, which were bespoke and for a particular part of the collection, I believe are not being touched. But the entry level and the second floor, which really were not very successful, practically speaking, and the lower floor, I think, too, which had galleries and an auditorium, I believe. I think that's what's being redone. So I myself, I'm anxious to see the results, and I'm not as hostile to them as some people are. I think, there's a lot of affection for Denise Scott Brown and a desire to respect the work of Venturi Scott Brown, and I understand that completely. But I think it's also true that, buildings are living objects, and this is a good example where you come up to a situation that a building, especially one of such public importance as this, has to maybe change and adapt with time. That's the lesson of many great buildings in great European cities. Rome is a good example.
Sure.
And there are others. London too. So I know that there is a desire to respect her concerns, but I for one am anxious to see how this turns out, and that comes from my own feeling that the building was never entirely successful. So we'll see.
Gotcha. Yep. That makes sense, and we are also very intrigued to see what happens. I know we're coming very close to the time here. The final question, which we typically ask, is, what is your favorite building?
Oh God!
But we'll have you on the show again for sure. I have no doubt. So the other question you can answer instead, which maybe will be easier, is, what is your favorite neighborhood in New York City and why?
Oh, okay, that one's
easier.
That was a little easier because I'm going to answer it by saying this. One of the joys and unbelievable privileges of my job has been that I get to travel all over New York. Even as a native New Yorker, I never saw this much of the city, never had to go to places where I go. Right now, by the way, I have an appointment and then I have to run to Sunset Park in Brooklyn to look at a new affordable housing project that includes a new library. It's really interesting project. I didn't spend my time running off to Sunset Park
Sure.
in the old days. So there are a lot of neighborhoods in New York that I really love and I could imagine living in, actually. But I'm a villager at heart, and I still love the village, although I could never afford to live there now. But there are things I just it's more like all things about love. It's not rational. It's just emotional. But there are things that I still love about it, and there are still remnants of the old village. Almost. For me, it's almost like going through one of those Harry Potter doors. I still see people and places that have not changed. There's still a kind of other village that exists there. And there's something about the scale of it and the way memory plays such an important role in how we move through spaces. That I can never get away from. I think I still dream sometimes when I wake up that I am in my childhood bedroom.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's probably not so unusual, but after all this time, it is kind of interesting. I grew up on one of the loudest streets in New York, so on one level, I'm very glad I'm not there. But on another, I still have some deep attachment to the light and the scale of the streets.
I love it. Michael, thank you so much for making the time to be on the show and chat with us. Hopefully the conversation can continue. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I hope so too.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. And if you like what we're doing, then please support us by leaving a review of the show in the Apple Podcast app. You can also find us on Spotify and YouTube. The show has an Instagram, which is secondstudiopod.com, so feel free to follow, leave comments, etc., etc. And you can reach out to us through those ways, also at hotline, which is 213-222-6950. So you can call and leave a voicemail or text message that hotline, and then we'll get back to you on the show or through text. And, of course, you can find our office online as well. We're out there. Stay tuned for more cool stuff coming up, and talk soon. Bye.